The town of Hollow Creek was bleeding out. That's how Dani's mother always put it, usually somewhere between her second and third glass of wine, staring at the water-stained ceiling of their kitchen, as if God might have written the reason up there in fine print. She wasn't wrong. The mills had closed, and the highway bypass had redirected everything and everyone worth redirecting, and what remained was a particular kind of rot that settles into places when hope stops visiting. Dani would sit at the dinner table and watch her mother's eyes go glassy and distant, and know that tonight was a night to be small and quiet. Her stepfather, Roy, would be home soon. She learned early how to read the signs. If his truck turned into the driveway slow, he'd had enough at Kelsey's bar to take the edge off without sharpening it into something worse. If it came in fast and careless, gravel sprang against the siding. She had minutes at most to get her little brother Theo into the bedroom closet and wedge a chair under the door handle. She'd gotten good at the wedge. Expert level, Theo liked to say, trying to make a joke out of it, because 9-year-olds will try to make a joke out of almost anything if the alternative is crying. There had been one night about 8 months back that Dani still couldn't fully think about straight. Roy had come home in that particular state she'd come to call the red zone. Past drunk, past angry, into something quieter and more deliberate. Her mother had burned dinner. That was the reason, or the excuse, the distinction having stopped mattering to Dani a long time ago. She'd been in her room finishing homework when she heard the first sounds through the wall. She sat perfectly still for 60 seconds, counting them, the way she'd taught herself. Then she went to the kitchen drawer and took out the longest knife. She got to the living room doorway and stopped. Roy stood with his back to her, her mother pressed against the far wall, and something about the angle of his shoulders and the deliberate stillness of his posture made Dani understand with absolute clarity that she was looking at a man capable of crossing a line that he hadn't crossed before. She raised the knife. Her hand was steady in a way that surprised her. Her mind was an open white space, clean and purposeless as fresh snow. He must have felt something shift in the air because he turned. The look on his face cycled through several expressions before landing on something ugly. He crossed the room in 2 steps and gripped her wrist, twisting until the knife clattered to the linoleum. She didn't cry out. She wouldn't give him that. He held her wrist until she felt the bones grind, and then he shoved her backwards into the refrigerator, hard enough that the magnets rained off it like hail. "Little bitch thinks she's brave," he said. She said nothing. "You think I don't know what you think of me?" Her mother's voice came from the corner, stripped of everything except raw necessity. "Roy, she's a child. You want to put your hands on me? Fine. Don't you touch her." Something moved behind his eyes. Not remorse. Dani knew better by then than to call it that, but a kind of calculation. He looked at her mother for a long moment, then back at Dani, then turned and walked to the bedroom and shut the door. They heard the television come on. Her mother helped her up from the floor and held her face in both hands, studying it the way you'd study a map of somewhere you were terrified to go. "Listen to me," she said quietly. "You don't do that again. You hear me? Whatever is happening in this house, you do not put yourself between it and me. Promise me." Dani looked at her mother's eyes, which were the same pale green as her own, and understood that love and futility were sometimes indistinguishable from each other. "I promise," she said. It was the only lie she'd ever told her mother and intended to keep. Since that night, Roy had not laid hands on either of them. He still got drunk. He still filled the rooms of that house with a particular poisonous weather system all his own, all pressure and no rain. But whatever calculation had moved behind his eyes that night seemed to have produced a result he'd decided to abide by, at least for now. Dani waited. She was patient in the way that people become patient when they understand that they are waiting for something inevitable. In the meantime, she sat at the dinner table and listened to Roy talk about Hollow Creek dying, which he did with a kind of drunk satisfaction, as if the town's failure was evidence of something he'd always suspected about the world. "Another one gone," he said one evening, stabbing at a piece of chicken. "That Ellis kid, 8 years old. Parents are losing their goddamn minds." Dani looked up before she could stop herself. "Marcus Ellis?" Roy frowned at his plate. "No, the other one. The sister. Petra." Dani exhaled, released her fork. She'd known Marcus Ellis for most of her life. They'd grown up 3 streets over from each other, bonded in 4th grade over a shared contempt for a particular teacher and a shared enthusiasm for horror movies their parents didn't know they were watching. In the last year or so, something had changed in how Dani thought about Marcus. Not dramatically. Not in any way she'd been able to articulate even to herself. But the change was there, quiet and insistent, the way a root works into concrete. The thought that he might be gone had moved through her like cold water. His sister Petra was 7. Dani knew her the way you know a younger sibling of a close friend. Not intimately, but with a particular warmth, as a piece of the larger world that contained someone you cared about. Petra collected interesting rocks. She'd shown Dani her collection once, narrating each specimen with a curator's solemnity. "May I be excused?" Dani was already pushing back her chair. "Be back before the streetlights," her mother said. Roy said nothing. He was studying his beer with great attention. Dani had made it half a block when she heard her name called behind her, thin and urgent, and turned to see Theo running full tilt down the sidewalk, his shoelaces undone, his dinosaur backpack bouncing. "Mom said I could come," he announced, arriving breathless. "Petra's my friend." "No, she isn't. You've talked to her twice." "She showed me her rocks. We're friends." Dani looked at him. 9 years old, scrawny, absolutely earnest, and thought about telling him to go home. "Fine," she said instead. "You stay right next to me and you do not say a word unless I tell you to." Theo nodded so seriously it almost broke her heart. The Ellis house was 4 streets down and one over, on the corner of Sallow Road where it dead-ended into the old Vanthorpe property. Dani had walked this route hundreds of times without paying the Vanthorpe place particular attention, the way you stop seeing things that have always been there. But tonight, with the early autumn fog beginning to unspool from the low ground near the creek, she found her eyes moving to it unbidden. It had been built in the 30s by Edmund Vanthorpe, who had made an inexplicable fortune through means that varied depending on which neighbor you asked, and spent some portion of that fortune on a house of extravagant, unsettling proportions. All stone with a widow's walk circling the 3rd floor, and windows that seemed in certain lights to have too many panes. The grounds were enclosed by a wrought iron fence, the rails topped with finials shaped, if you looked at them directly, like nothing in particular, and, if you looked at them sidelong, like something you wouldn't want to think about. The property had sat empty for 37 years. The town had made various administrative attempts to deal with it over the decades, all of which had somehow quietly failed. Dani had grown up with the stories, everyone had. She'd never given them more than the casual credence you extend to local mythology. She knocked on the Ellis door. Marcus answered it himself, and she was struck immediately by how wrong he looked. Not grief wrong. She'd expected that. But a different kind of wrong. A fundamental wrongness in the set of his expression, like someone had adjusted the contrast on a photograph of him without changing anything else. "Hey," she said, "we heard about Petra. We just wanted to—" "Come in," he said, and stepped back. The living room was occupied by his parents in adjacent chairs, each encased in their own private shock. Marcus led Dani and Theo to his room without speaking. Theo stayed very close. Marcus's room was dim, the blinds drawn, the desk covered in papers and what looked like photocopies of documents. A leather-bound journal, old, its cover cracked and dark with handling, lay open at the center of the desk. He sat on the edge of his bed and looked at Dani with eyes that had something behind them she couldn't name. "What do you know about Edmund Vanthorpe?" he asked. Dani looked at the desk, looked back at him. "The usual stuff. Made money somehow. Built that house. His wife disappeared." She stopped, started again. "He died in the house. Badly. He killed his housekeeper," Theo said quietly, "and the man who kept the grounds. And then he went up to the top floor and he jumped." Marcus looked at Theo. "Yeah, that's the story." He picked up the journal. "This is what actually happened." It took Dani 40 minutes to read the relevant sections Marcus had marked. The journal belonged to Edmund Vanthorpe. The handwriting was cramped and increasingly erratic as the pages progressed. The ink at certain passages pressed so hard it had torn through. When she finished, she set it down carefully. "Where did you find this?" "In the house. In the room at the top. Under a false panel in the floor." He looked at her steadily. "I know what you're thinking." "I'm thinking Vanthorpe was disturbed." "I thought so too. I spent 2 weeks thinking so. Then I found the other things." He moved to the desk and spread out the photocopies. Police reports from the night of Vanthorpe's death. Newspaper accounts of the woman referred to in all of them only as E. Vanthorpe, wife, as if she'd never had a name of her own. And then a separate folder, thicker, held together with a rubber band that had dried and cracked with age. "I got that from the county records office," Marcus said. "Missing persons reports. Children mostly. Going back to within a year of when the house went dark. Irregular but continuous. They just sort of stopped getting investigated. Every few years another one. Another cluster. Then quiet again for a while." Dani stared at the folder. "You think these are connected?" "I think Vanthorpe kept something in that house. And I think when he died, it got partway out." He said this in a flat, level voice. The voice of someone who had already done all their arguing with themselves and reached the far side of it. "And I think she took Petra." Dani chose her next words carefully. "Marcus, they haven't found a body." He laughed, short and without humor. "No, they won't." Dani went still. "What do you mean?" Marcus looked at the window. Outside, the fog had thickened perceptibly. "She comes at night. Petra does. She's out there in the yard. She looks up at my window with these eyes that—" He stopped, collected himself. "She doesn't look like herself. I mean, she does, physically. But the way she moves, the way she looks at me, like I'm a door she wants to open from the outside." Theo had gone completely silent beside Dani, his hand finding hers in the dimness. "She's on the second floor," Marcus said quietly, anticipating Dani's objection. Dani looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Have you told your parents?" "I told them I see her. My mom started crying. My dad called the doctor." He rubbed his face. "The thing is, she doesn't come when other people are watching. Only me. Every night. Just me." "The journal," Dani said. "It mentions something about how to contain it again." "More than mentions." He reached past her and turned to a section near the back. The pages were covered in symbols, annotated in Vanthorpe's cramped hand. Explanations of their placement, their function, what they were meant to hold. A diagram showed the room at the top of the house. Many of the symbols on the walls were marked with small notations. Intact, 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 damaged, intact, damaged here, spreading. He knew something was wrong with the containment. He wrote about it for 3 months before he died. He couldn't fix it himself because he was afraid to go back in the room. So he killed the 2 people who knew about it, so they couldn't tell anyone, and then he chose to die rather than try, Dani said. "Yeah." Marcus looked at the journal. "I'm not him." Dani understood then what the wrongness she'd seen in his expression was. It was resolution. It was someone who had already decided. "I'm not letting you do this alone," she said. He shook his head. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She reached past him and closed the journal. "We go tonight, before you talk yourself out of it, or I talk myself out of it." She looked at Theo. "You're going home." Theo lifted his chin. "I came to help." "You came because you told Mom you were coming with me. That's different. Go home. You need someone to—" "Theo." She bent down to his level. "Please, go home. Lock your bedroom door. If Roy gets loud, go out the window and down to Mrs. Paulson's next door." "Okay." He looked at her with those 2 serious 9-year-old eyes. "You're coming back." "Yes." "That's not a maybe yes. That's a real yes." She put her hand on his face. "Real yes. Go." She watched him go down the street until the fog swallowed him, then turned back to Marcus. They went at midnight. The fog was extraordinary by then, a living thing, pressing against the streetlights so that each one was surrounded by its own dim halo and nothing more. The Vanthorpe house materialized out of the white as they approached it, stone by stone, the way a bad memory comes back. First the outlines, then the specifics, then the details you'd been hoping you'd misremembered. The gate had a chain loop through it, long since rusted open, so that pulling it free was silent. The garden path was gravel under years of dead leaves and reaching undergrowth, and they moved through it carefully, Dani holding the flashlight while Marcus carried the bag. Chalk, a fine brush, the journal open to the right page, sealed in a plastic bag against the damp. The front door was unlocked. It swung open on a darkness so complete it seemed to have density, and for a moment they stood at the threshold, unable to make themselves cross it. Together, Marcus said. Together, Dani agreed. Inside, the flashlight picked out details in sequence. A hallway, wallpaper hanging in long, dry strips. A staircase to the left with a collapsed banister. Furniture under dust covers that the light turned into hunched white shapes. The smell was cold and dry and very old. The smell of a space that had been sealed up with something it wasn't willing to give back. The staircase held. They avoided the left side where the banister had pulled the boards loose and kept to the right, close to the wall. The second-floor hallway ended in a narrower set of stairs leading up, and those stairs ended in a ladder, newer than anything else in the house, which struck Dani as strange, until Marcus said low, Vanthorpe replaced the original one. He was going up there regularly for a while, trying different things. The room at the top was small, tucked under the peak of the roof, its single window looking out over the dead garden, and beyond the fence, the empty street. The symbols covered every wall. Dani had seen them in the journal, but here they were something else. Here, they were something that made the eye want to skid away from them, that created a mild but definite nausea when looked at directly. They had been painted in dark pigment, and in places they seemed to have an undertone that the flashlight couldn't quite account for. There, Marcus said, directing the beam to the far wall. The damage was visible immediately. A swath of symbols that had been disrupted, the lines broken and smeared, as if something with a great deal of intent had worked at them from the wrong side. She's been at this for years, Dani said, and she finally got enough of a gap to start pulling things through. Marcus set down the bag and opened it, removing the chalk and brush. He opened the journal to the diagram. You hold the light, I'll work, don't look at the window. Why not? Because she'll come, and if she gets your attention, he paused. Just don't. Whatever you see in your peripheral vision, don't look at it directly. Dani positioned herself and held the light steady on the damaged section. Marcus began to work, copying the symbols with the focused attention of someone who understood that accuracy here was not optional. His hand was steady. Dani watched his face and thought, this is what you look like when you're out of alternatives. She was watching his face when she felt the quality of the air in the room change. Not dramatically, a drop in temperature, a sensation as of pressure, of volume filling. She was very careful not to turn her head. In her peripheral vision, the window lightened. Marcus, she said. I feel it, he said. I'm almost done. Just something in the corner of her vision was not the window anymore. It was a shape. It occupied the space of the window, but it was not the window. It was the negative of light. The place light went when it was called somewhere else. And it had a face, if you could call it that. And the face was looking at her the way a locked door looks at a key. Dani's hand holding the flashlight began to lower. She didn't choose to lower it. She observed it lowering as if from a slight distance, with a kind of academic interest, as if this were happening to someone who merely resembled her. The light dropped toward the floor. Theo, she thought. The thought arrived cleanly and without drama, simply a fact. Theo was at home and Roy might be drunk, and I promised. She jerked the flashlight back up. The shock of it sent a crack through whatever had been settling over her mind. She gasped, the sound too loud in the small room, and Marcus's head snapped up. Dani! I'm fine. Finish. Finish! He turned back to the wall. 5 more seconds. 10. She kept her eyes on the back of his head and thought about Theo's face when she told him, real yes. She thought about what real meant and made it mean something in the specific muscles of her hand and forearm. Done, Marcus said. The quality of the air changed again. Differently this time. Not the drop of something arriving, but the slow release of something losing its foothold. A sound, barely audible, that was not quite a sound but was felt in the back teeth. The presence in the peripheral vision did not dissipate. It compressed, became smaller, became the concentrated fury of something that understood what had just happened to it. Then it was only the window. Marcus let out a breath. Go, he said. We need to go right now. They went, down the ladder, down the narrow stairs, into the second-floor hallway, and stopped. The hallway was not empty. Children stood in it, 4 of them, evenly spaced. They were dressed in clothing of different eras, and their eyes were the color of very deep water, and their faces held the particular blankness of something wearing an expression it had learned by watching rather than feeling. Dani recognized none of them. Then she recognized one. Petra Ellis stood at the end of the line, near the staircase, and her face was the face Petra had always had, except for the eyes and for the quality behind them, which was not Petra, which had never been Petra, which wore Petra the way you'd wear a coat you'd found discarded somewhere. Marcus made a sound that was very small and very broken. Dani gripped his arm. Don't look at her eyes. Look at her chin. Walk. Dani. Walk. She moved forward. The children did not move. She kept her eyes at chin level and kept moving, pulling Marcus with her. And the children turned as they passed but did not reach for them. Did not speak, only watched with those deep water eyes. She felt the weight of the watching like a physical thing pressing on the back of her neck. The staircase, down it, hallway, front door. Out. She did not stop pulling Marcus until they were through the gate and on the sidewalk. He stopped there and she let him stop because she needed to stop too. They stood in the fog, breathing. It didn't work, he said. She's still in the house. The thing is still in the house. What's in the house is not Petra. Dani said it firmly because she needed to say it firmly, because the alternative was not productive. The house is contained now. The symbols are repaired. Whatever's in there is back behind the door, all the way behind it. It can't reach out anymore. He looked at her. His eyes were wet. Petra's gone. Yes. She didn't look away from him. I'm sorry. Yes. They stood there for a moment in the white silence of the fog. Then a sound reached them from the direction of the house. Not a voice, not a scream, just a soft, rhythmic sound, like small knuckles tapping on glass from above. They did not turn around. They walked away from the sound together, and after a while it stopped, or the fog absorbed it, and there was only the sound of their own footsteps. Behind them, the Vanthorpe house settled into its stillness. The window at the top reflected nothing. The gate stood ajar, rust on the hinge. The path beyond it swallowed in white. Pete Alderman had been drinking more since the factory closed, which was the kind of information that surprised no one, including Pete himself. He had the self-awareness of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and did it anyway, which was perhaps the worst kind of self-awareness to have. He walked Sallow Road at close to 1 a.m. because he couldn't sleep and because the house was a box he couldn't stand to be in. Carol had left. He didn't blame her. He blamed himself the way you blame a force of nature. Thoroughly, abstractly, without any expectation that the blame would change anything about the weather. He'd done things he couldn't undo. He knew it. The knowing didn't make him good. It just made him aware of how bad he was. His son Dani had walked out 3 months ago when he'd caught Pete with his hand raised over Carol's face. Dani had stepped between them and looked at him with eyes that held something far older than 17, and Pete had understood in that moment that he had lost his son completely and that it had been his own doing. Dani hadn't spoken to him since. He stopped in front of the Vanthorpe place. He'd heard about the Ellis girl and about the other children before her, the ones going back through the records that the new detective had started pulling, apparently following up some lead from the Ellis boy. He looked at the old stone house and felt a familiar contempt for ghost stories, for things that couldn't be touched or punched or fixed. He should burn it down. The thought arrived the same way these thoughts did, low and certain, the decision already made by the time it announced itself. He had a lighter. The place was old, dry, filled with the accumulated refuse of decades. It would go quickly. He pushed open the gate. The fog thickened as he moved up the path, thickened in a way that the rational part of his mind, the part that was still operating, noted as unusual. By the time he reached the foot of the steps, he could see perhaps 3 feet in any direction. He stopped to look for his lighter. "Dad." Pete Alderman was drunk enough that he processed the word before he processed the impossibility of it. He looked up and Dani was there, just outside arm's reach, in the fog. Pale, eyes wrong, dark in a way the light couldn't account for. Dark like something you'd see at the bottom of a well. But Dani's face. Dani's exact face. "Dani!" Pete's voice broke on the word. He hadn't heard from him in 3 months. He hadn't known how much that silence weighed until this moment. "Son, I'm here," Dani said. There was no warmth in it, but Pete's mind supplied the warmth because it was desperate for it. "We all are. We wanted to see you." "We?" Pete said. Something moved in the fog at Dani's shoulder. Small shapes, child height, and among them a smaller one that Pete recognized distantly. The Ellis girl, though he hadn't known her well. And behind them all, barely visible, a woman in light clothing, her face oriented toward Pete with an attention that felt like a hand around his heart. Pete Alderman was not a man who frightened easily. He had made a point of not frightening easily, had built his sense of himself substantially around that particular not fearing. But something in the quality of those eyes, the woman's eyes behind the children, moved through his considerable defenses and settled into the oldest part of him, the part that is present in all human beings before the personality forms over it, the part that understands darkness by instinct. He took a step back. The figures moved with him, not rushing, simply contracting the distance he'd tried to open. He took another step back. His heel found the edge of a step, and he sat down hard on it. The fog pressed in. The figures were very close now, and Dani was reaching for him with a hand that was not quite right, the angle of the wrist not quite anatomically plausible, the movement not quite the movement of a boy who'd grown up in Pete's own house. "Dani," Pete said, and it wasn't a greeting anymore. It was a plea, or maybe a question, or maybe an accusation, the last word in a long argument. The fog swallowed everything. The shapes moved in it. For a moment, the only sound was the creek running somewhere in the darkness beyond the fence, patient and indifferent, the way water is. Then that too was gone. The Vanthorpe property was quiet. The gate stood at the end of the path, slightly open, the street beyond it visible as a gray smear in the white. The window at the top of the house was dark. Whatever the house contained it completely now. Held it the way a locked box holds something it has been given to keep. Hollow Creek was dying, and the fog rolled through its empty streets, and the creek ran on in the dark, and the house stood at the end of Sallow Road and waited, patient as stone, patient as old hunger, patient as everything that has learned it does not need to hurry.